Well, hello and welcome to the third of our series, What Really Matters. And we've decided to devote this one to the new initiative to create SHAPE. SHAPE, an acronym for Social Sciences, Humanities and Arts for People and the Economy. I saw an article towards the end of June in the Observer describing this new initiative, and Patricia Daly, my co-convener, and I immediately decided that it's really important to become involved and to start talking to people about it. And it's very good to see that there is a lot more online presence already connected with this initiative. And we have a very diverse and fascinating panel of attendees today. What we're going to do is I will very briefly ask each participant in the panel to introduce themselves. And afterwards, Professor Julia Black, who was intimately involved with this initiative, will tell us a little bit more about it. Afterwards, we'll tackle the questions that were advertised one by one. And finally, about 1:30, there will be an opportunity for audience members to ask questions. And obviously, the panelists will be answering depending on where their interests lie and where they think that they can best contribute. So if I could just ask everyone who is on the panel to introduce themselves very briefly. Julia?
So good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much for having me and for having this panel on SHAPE. I'm Julia Black, I'm a Professor of Law at the LSE. I'm also Strategic Director of Innovation there, which is like a Pro Vice Chancellor role. I'm also a fellow of the British Academy, and I'm on the UKRI board. So I have a number of different hats, but I'm speaking as me, as it were, in this panel today.
Dane?
Hi, my name's Dane Comerford. I run the Oxford Science and Ideas Festival, known as IF Oxford, which a few years ago pivoted to embrace a whole range of other subjects and not just the traditional STEM subjects. So we've been very much kind of keen to kind of develop an arts, humanities, social sciences context for this sort of engagement. I think SHAPE is a really useful framework to start thinking about that further.
Thank you. Patricia?
Patricia, you're on mute. Paulina, if you mute it.
I'm Patricia Daly. I'm Vice Principal of Jesus College and Professor of the Human Geography of Africa in the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford.
And I'm Paulina Hughes. I'm a tutorial fellow in English literature at Jesus, but my work is very strongly interdisciplinary, so I teach and publish on history and early modern political thought. Katherine?
I'm Katherine Cole. I'm Professor of German at Jesus College. And for the last 4 years, I've been leading an AHRC-funded project called Creative Multilingualism, which was designed to really make the case for modern languages in an interdisciplinary way. And what we were trying to do with lots of different disciplines involved and different institutions and different external partners was to demonstrate the interaction and interplay between creativity and language diversity.
Dermot?
Hello, I'm Dermot Mcculloch. I'm Vice President of the British Academy with the brief of public engagement, in other words, promoting humanities and social sciences to the wider world, to government, and generally raise profiles in that. So this is a very relevant subject for me. Before I retired, I was Professor of the History of the Church in the University of Oxford. So it's history of Christianity is my particular thing.
And Joanna?
Oh, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for inviting me to speak about my passion, which is geography. So my name is Johanna Waters. I've just been recently promoted to Professor of Human Geography at University College London.
Thank you. And thanks again to everyone for joining us and to the panelists. Julia, since you were basically the prime mover behind this initiative, if you could tell us a little bit more about what SHAPE is, what its aims are, and what the ambitions are.
Excellent, thank you. So SHAPE is, for me, born, I have to say, after a little bit of irritation, and some of that irritation is to do with stemming partly originally from policymakers and always having to be articulating the case for social science, arts and humanities. And it was born out of a reflective conversation that I was listening to between various life scientists who were talking about how they'd managed to coordinate themselves, 20 years ago, really. And by kind of burying their differences or coming together, they've managed to create a much more powerful voice for life sciences, which have been very effective, which it has been. And so I was just suddenly struck then that actually across social sciences, arts and humanities, we're so diverse internally, but we've never really, and there are lots and lots of different organizations and learned societies and individual academics and groups, and all putting forward the value of their part of social science, arts, humanities. But without a kind of a common approach or a common set of messages, then that's quite dissipated. And any force which is dissipated doesn't have the same impact as any force which is slightly more concentrated, as it were. And so I literally just convened a group of kind of like-minded souls that who are obviously kind of key presences in this space. So at the LSE, I've been Pro-Vice Chancellor for research there since about 2014. So I've been making the case for social sciences in that capacity for an awfully long time. British Academy is obvious, crosses social sciences and humanities. Also the Academy of Social Sciences, again, long been campaigning in this area, campaign for social science. But we wanted someone, we were conscious that we're still quite social science and humanities, so Arts Council England were also involved. We brought them in. And then, to be honest, just a lot of committed individuals, people like Peter Bazalgette, David Willits, Vivian Parr, who's a UKRI board member and a science journalist, actually, but very committed to promoting social science, arts, humanities. Ian Diamond, heads the ONS, etc. So really to start thinking about, well, what could the common messages be that we could be putting forward about the values of the disciplines, and thinking about, well, around the way that our subjects create, the methods that we use, the different mindsets that, if you're working the arts, humanities and social sciences, that you bring to issues, and then how we project different modes of expression. And thinking, well, how could we be articulating the value of our subjects across in a way which captures all of those different things. And the first thing we said is we wouldn't sweat about a new acronym. So there's the irony. And then we started talking about this and started, in a way, SHAPE emerged through our conversations. And we started testing out the idea on a wider group of stakeholders, if you were, a wider group around the community. And it was immediately picked up as being, well, it would be obvious you'd then have STEM and you'd have SHAPE. And by giving a single name, as it were, to a hugely heterogeneous group of subjects, we thought, well, actually, that's what happens in STEM. STEM is massively heterogeneous. But the advantages that they have is it doesn't mean that the chemical engineer needs to make the case for chemical engineering specifically versus the life scientist, or as opposed to the theoretical mathematician or the structural engineer. They're all just STEM. So, and that conjures up a sense in people's minds of what those subjects are. So we also commissioned a YouGov poll of the public, actually, to see, well, what did they understand of STEM meant, and what did they understand social sciences, humanities and arts meant. And to be honest, quite a recognition that, well, STEM is just science, and social science, arts, humanities are kind of everything else. And people obviously naturally go into the subjects that they've done at school. but not a great really understanding, particularly of social sciences, more for arts, because that's kind of more like something you had on your timetable when you were at school. But once it was explained to them, we then asked, well, what would be what do you see the perceived value of learning STEM and subjects as opposed to social science, arts, humanities subjects? And the answers were, well, we see value in both. They came out pretty even, actually, on that assessment. And so part of the ambition, therefore, for SHAPE is, I think, really to do three things. The first is simply, in a way, providing a new collective name, a new collective label. And if people simply start referring to STEM and SHAPE quite naturally, as then encompassing the whole of our knowledge base, then in a way that's in itself a success, that SHAPE just becomes part of the vocabulary. But there are a couple of other aims which are linked to that. And they are, first, by providing that collective name, I think you give more force, as it were, to any one particular argument or any one particular activity or any one particular venture which people are doing under the banner of sort of social science, arts, humanities. You can just now say, well, it's all part of SHAPE. And so in a way, by attaching oneself to that sort of larger brand, as it were, it kind of hopefully will magnify the impact that any of those conversations will have, or any of those articulations will have. And then the other related aim, so to be the third related aim, is in a way to give legibility to these subjects, to say, well, let's look at this huge variety that there are within STEM, within SHAPE subjects, just as there are within STEM. And it's to say, look, we go all the way from, detailed economic regression models through to performing arts. We've got a thing on the website, modes of expression go from data to drama, from statistics to sound, different modes of critical analysis. So just the richness, we hope, of our disciplines will be able to express that in a way, in a kind of a more coherent way, which then, as I say, will give power and force to the argument. So it's partly, as Dan said, it is partly a sort of public understanding exercise of the value of these disciplines that could then have spin-offs in different ways. So part of the thinking about those year 9s conversations in schools, when teachers and parents are thinking about, well, can you ever get what's the point in doing a history degree or ancient classics or any of those? Why don't you go and do something vocational or STEM, all the way through to policymakers and funding decisions, etc. So that's the ambition. That's the ambition, to provide a collective name for an incredibly rich and diverse set of subjects, to demonstrate that we matter too. It's not in competition with STEM, but we have full intrinsic value, and we can stand proud alongside STEM, and working together we can be truly transformative.
Thank you very much. It's really important, the name, isn't it?
Yeah.
When I was enthusing about the name, someone said to me, what couldn't you do before that you can do now? And I think what this panel really is about is to say how much more we actually can do under the banner of SHAPE. Dermot, you were also involved in conversations about SHAPE through the British Academy. So maybe you could give us your thoughts, and then we'll turn to other members of the panel who know more about SHAPE through the press than any inside knowledge.
Yeah, well, my business has been to try and find a way of explaining to the public what humanities is in particular, and social sciences, because these are very abstract now. They're sort of academic jargon things. And in general, I think you can say that the Royal Society, our sister academy, with its concentration on sciences, engineering, that sort of thing, medicine, has an easy job, because, it's about curing cancer, it's about getting to the moon. And those are fine things to do. What do you say that the role of the British Academy is, the humanities and social sciences? Well, it's the rest of human wisdom. And it is the wise part of human wisdom. I will say that quite aggressively. We are the people who show you how human society works. And there is no better example of that than the present pandemic. you could regard it as a medical problem, which of course it is. And it is wonderful, the work of Oxford and Imperial College, etc., the wonderful work they're doing. But clearly this is not just a medical event. It is a social event. It is a political event. And it's quite easy straight away to see that its impact is in different places. Different in the UK, in Central Europe, different again from Rwanda, different from New Zealand. And you need to say, well, why is this? This is not just a matter of medical business. It is a matter of the way in which a society has reacted to the situation. And in particular, the way in which regionality suddenly comes out. And what does that tell you about human behavior, the structures within which human beings exist? So that's a very cogent present example. I will say that my own work on the history of Christianity over the last 40, 50 years has also made this point very strongly to me. When I was an undergraduate, which was the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, religion appeared to be on the way out. And so you might say that church history was, you know, the history of the maniple or something like that, something which is a purely antiquarian interest and doesn't have any particular relevance. Right, well, in 1977 to 1978, we discovered that religion was back with our vengeance. And if you didn't understand it, you would misunderstand societies disastrously. And you wouldn't understand it unless you understood the history of the way in which religions had been constructed. And that just has so many spin-offs, say, in development and helping societies which need assistance, technical, economic assistance, to move forward. If you send out economists, if you send out technicians, you will do quite a lot. But they will run up against the ways in which that particular society works, its assumptions. They will make terrible mistakes of etiquette. And that is the sort of thing which the study of humanities, which is the study of human beings, and the social sciences, the study of societies, that's what you will really need. I hope it's QED after what I've said.
The novel by A.G. Wells, The Shape of Things to Come, I believe sees religion as very much on the way out. So this is another proof that how wrong he was in his predictions. Dane, you're coming from a very different perspective. And again, when I talk to people about this upcoming session, they made the point that it's always a bad idea to discuss a project, for instance, the shape, without a perspective of someone who actually studied science and is engaged more widely with public impact. And of course, as director of the Oxford Science Festival, and you led Cambridge public engagement, I imagine your perspective on this initiative will be particularly illuminating to our participants.
Sure, thank you for the introduction to speak. I think it's a really good session today just to kind of think about these issues. And of course, you know, in the past, the Oxford Science Festival, which has been going since about 1992, has focused primarily on STEM subjects. And it was in 2017 when I moved to Oxford away from Cambridge. I said, you know, if this thing is going to kind of exist into the future, it really needs to begin to embrace a whole other range of academic and economic and cultural kind of aspects for it to work appropriately in the modern day. And that's when we kind of moved to become the Oxford Science and Ideas Festival. So we spend a lot of time thinking about audience perceptions and identity. And so I think it's really good that, you know, we're thinking about academic subjects using the lens of marketing and branding and how these subjects are represented in the public space. But I think a really important feature is also to consider how these subjects are received by different sorts of audiences in different segments of society. So we oftentimes think about those people, so for instance, in the STEM context, we might think about those people who are professionally connected to science. I'm just going to use the word science now. And it might be that around 8% of the UK adult population is professionally connected with a scientific kind of endeavour. as a scientist or as a kind of curator of scientific knowledge. There's about 15% or so, these are numbers from the King's College London Culture Tracker survey, and I've got a slide that I could show that helps speed this conversation up if you wanted. Sorry, I've been muted, unmuted. And then I'm just going to share this slide because it will just help. Well, no, I can't share the slide, so I'll just talk through it. So about 15% of the population isn't professionally connected to something like science, but is attracted to it. So they might be seeking out scientific content as a thing to do in their spare time. About half the population are relatively ambivalent to the kind of institution of science. And so they're not seeking out a science activity, but they might, you know, if they stumble across, for instance, a lovely documentary with David Attenborough talking about, you know, exotic kind of places and animals doing things, because it's beautifully presented and is relevant at the moment to the audience, people will dwell on that subject and engage with it in a way that's meaningful for them. And then about a quarter of the population don't see science as for them. It's nerdy, it's geeky, it's boring, it's full of old white men in lab coats looking like Albert Einstein. So there's an identity issue. And there are similar sorts of numbers for the kind of arts and humanities and social sciences institution in the public space. People are either positively attracted to it, negatively attracted to it, or just have other things to do in their lives. And if it's not relevant for them at the time being, they won't necessarily engage with the subject. So that's what we've been trying to do with STEM for the past few decades, and just thinking about audience segmentation and kind of how different organizations, individuals, and segments of society connect with something like SHAPE, I think is a really powerful way of thinking how this sort of branded kind of collected effort could usefully be deployed amongst different kind of societies so they can own the discourse. And so I think that's what a lot of science engagement has really thought through over the past decade or so, is how can you give the power away from the academic kind of space that might be really good at kind of producing the knowledge in the first place, but how can you give that power away to different audiences so they can feel ownership of the subject? And at that point, people can then really start seeing the value of it in the context of their own lives. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I could turn to Katherine Cole, who has run this extraordinary multilingualism project. Katherine, perhaps you could share some experiences stemming from that and applying them to the topic of to the issue of SHAPE.
Thanks for putting that. I think it's a fantastic initiative because for the last 4 years, I've been very much engaged, well, longer than that really, at the point when we were applying for this project, engaged in the question of how do you make a humanities subject, how do you make the case for it, with languages being particularly challenged in the UK, with numbers going down in schools and so on. But then you start seeing the same kind of problem of emerging for history, for English and so on, and continually being on the defensive, having to make the case in terms that can compete with sciences is not really a fruitful starting point. And for our project, it was enormously helpful to have people from different disciplines all involved in the same conversation and gradually finding common ground in the way in which we were looking at language, so involving linguistics, involving anthropology, biology, as well as English, modern languages, and so on. And I think to have that kind of interdisciplinary conversation, you really need to give weight to all parts of the conversation. So looking at my own interest in it, which is in metaphor, so I'm working on the creative power of metaphor. I was working with 2 postdocs who were coming from it, from the linguistic side, and from particularly cognitive linguistics. And I was struck that whereas for me, metaphor is something that starts in ancient Greece in terms of the discussion, then is very much still informed by some of the kind of tensions between rhetoric, philosophy, and so on. And I'm also very interested in the cognitive science side. But for postdocs who come from the cognitive sciences, it was almost as though that was now old hat. That wasn't really relevant anymore, and you were having to look, you were looking primarily at data which was being collected in a scientific way. And the question then is really, how do you marry up those different disciplines and get away from the idea that one is old-fashioned, one is, as it were, modern, one is, as it were, making contact with, as it were, modern linguistics, which then takes its cue much more from the sciences, you might say, or certainly from the social sciences than from the humanities. And I think the way forward has to be to bring all those different parts of the discipline into play with each other, and at that point it then really becomes fruitful because you can then learn from each other. I think there's also a human rights issue there, which is much as with languages. Endangered languages means that if a language dies out, it means that a whole people has no opportunity to express itself with the kind of knowledge, with the way of thinking that comes through. And I think the same is true for humanities more generally and social sciences. If we move towards a society where the only thing that's valued is STEM subjects and children get pushed into STEM subjects, well, people like myself who quite liked sciences but didn't really feel very at home with it, it didn't appeal to my imagination, they become really then disenfranchised. They're no longer really valued. They don't see that their particular abilities and interests are part of what is valued across society. So I think it's terribly important that we do value those subjects educationally and in research and beyond.
Thank you very much, Katherine. And I'm so glad that you raised the question of education and, of course, subject choices. And Dane mentioned the issue of identity. And I wonder if I could ask Patricia and Joanna, who are both geographers, and of course, geography as a subject is itself hugely multidisciplinary and can go in so many directions. To comment on this, and in particular, I think we really need to confront the issue of race, which is connected both with the shape STEM split, but also with the question of languages. After all, this country is very much multilingual and the proportions are changing. Katherine, you told me the other day that the number of people taking GCSEs in Polish has grown exponentially over the past few years at the expense, for instance, of Welsh. So perhaps we could hear from Patricia first and then Joanna on this subject. Patricia, you're muted. In particular, the fact that students from ethnic minorities are often pushed by their parents to choose subjects which are seen as more reputable to do with STEM rather than shape.
Okay, I'm going to talk as a geographer, and I hope I will not comment on what Joanna is planning to say. As you say, geography has both a science, a physical science, and a human science, social science dimension to it. And so I think over the years, as a subject has become institutionalized from about the late 19th century onwards, there's always been a tension between the physical and the human side of the discipline. And many people actually don't realize that, some scientific work is done within geography, but my colleagues, particularly now, working in areas of climate change, do what could be considered hard science. But one of I think the important element about geography is its interdisciplinarity and the fact that geographers are trained to look at both the scientific aspects of a problem as well as the social science aspects. And even some do what we could consider humanities work, particularly historical geographers. What then I think I'm interested in as a geographer is to highlight the need, as was said earlier. There is obviously, in relation to COVID, we need to address some of the social science, the issues around societal issues, in order to better comprehend how we can address a pandemic. But I think what COVID also illustrates is the capacity, the ability to intersect, to work together, the need for interdisciplinary approach to these problems if we are going to solve them. So it actually gives equal weighting to both the physical and what we call in geography the human side of a subject. And so, I mean, I think, there are, for a long time, certainly within Britain, there have been very few what we call Black geographers, or geographers from ethnic minority backgrounds. Of course, this is different in other parts of the world, where, geography as a subject has not appealed because it has, I think they've been concerned as to its utility value in the workplace. What can you do with the subject? But I think what we geographers will say, you can do almost anything with the subject because it teaches you this range of skills. You can come out of a geography discipline being able to do statistics quite well and going to work for a merchant bank, as well as going to work for a heritage foundation, working on or in for an international organizations, for example, such as the Department for International Development, where we have lots of students who are interested in development issues. So there's a whole range of careers and opportunities and ways of thinking, I think, that geographers bring to some of these societal problems. And I'll give Joanna some time.
Yes, I mean, I've got a few points I want to make in relation to geography, just in relation to what Patricia just said. I mean, one of the things we tell on our open days, we tell our undergrads is that, geographers are very, very employable because they are seen to have these transferable skills in exactly the way that Patricia outlined. They they can interpret maps, they understand statistics, but they also understand human behavior and societies and importantly, how they relate. But I've got, maybe we'll come back to some of these points sort of in the later discussion. What I was going to say by way of introduction really was just to give a very, very brief overview of the kind of my own background, because I read geography at Jesus a while ago now, and then I've moved through a series of geography departments. So I went to UBC in Vancouver for 5 years to do my master's and my PhD, and my first job was at Liverpool in the geography department, and then Birmingham, and then Oxford, and now UCL. And so one thing I just wanted to mention in relation to this discussion was in different departments, I've seen university restructuring, and I've seen geography departments being put in schools of geoscience, environmental science, and I've seen the kind of impact of that on human geography in particular, and the identity of human geographers, and the way that by being put in these kind of placing these schools of science, the value attached to their research and their writing has kind of been diminished. So the metrics have changed in these departments from valuing quality publications and outreach and engagement to very much an emphasis on kind of grant capture and having kind of a big scientific team behind you. So that's something that for many years I've kind of reflected on, really, the way in which some geography departments in the UK have been absorbed within these kind of wider schools of science. The other point I want to make in relation to that, with a kind of, and I hope we come back to this really, is the kind of gender dimensions to this, because I think sidelining shaped disciplines has a quite an interesting, multifaceted gender impact. So yeah, so that's something that if we have time later on in the discussion, maybe we could come back to. What I wanted to say really is that I think, and Dermot already made my case quite easy in the sense that he highlighted the geography of the pandemic on a kind of national scale. We need geography, we need shaped disciplines to understand, the very complex and shifting world that we find ourselves in presently. So I find that these disciplines are urgently relevant. There's a kind of urgency to our need to kind of embrace them, I feel. Before we get on to COVID, I just wanted to very briefly mention two examples, one of which Patricia's already mentioned, and that's the climate crisis and the so-called European refugee crisis. And I was thinking that in order to understand these crises at different scales, we need a perspective that allows us to consider the bigger picture. So for me, part of the appeal of geography is being able to sort of take a step back. It's not being absorbed in kind of navel gazing or kind of tiny detail, but being able to see how things fit together. So as near as you can get to a holistic understanding of what's going on. So tackling the climate crisis, of course, it's just like COVID, it's a medical crisis. So, you know, global warming is a scientific issue, but you also, of course, need to understand human behavior. You need to understand the geographically differentiated impacts of heating on different communities, the structural factors preventing societal change, and so on and so on. And I think, you know, geography as a discipline is very well placed for kind of being able to sort of understand all of those dimensions. You know, shape generally allows us to ask the question or address the question of why, you know, why is it this way? You can describe it in this way, but the question of why is something that I think our disciplines are best placed to answer. And I just wanted to mention the European refugee crisis, because our students are kind of have been over the past few years very concerned about this and the way it's framed and debated in the media. And geographer Alison Mounts pointed out that it's not actually a European refugee crisis at all. It's a Syrian crisis, it's an Albanian crisis, it's an Iraqi crisis. And I think that makes a point that geography matters and representations matter for people's lives and directly influence migration policy and national responses to these crises. I've nearly finished. I just wanted to talk about empathy, because I feel, again, that shape disciplines allow us to empathize in a way that STEM does not. We are able to, we deal with nuance, and I think that's important, and we deal with tailored responses to crises, not a one-size-fits-all blanket response to crises. And I think that kind of nuanced perspective is really, really important. And finally, about COVID, I had to mention, you know, the differential impact of the disease, the devastating impact on BME communities, on women's careers in particular. We're seeing, you know, these impacts are just rolling out now, but we're kind of aware that the longer term impacts are going to be significantly felt by women, people on low paid jobs and precarious workers. And again, to understand this, you know, these are not medical issues, as Dermot says. You know, these are shape issues. Shape disciplines will allow us to take a historical perspective, allow us to take a broader perspective, a network perspective on these questions. And I think, you know, what we need to argue as a group is that the only way we can not only rebuild our societies from this, but actually make our societies better, is by deploying shape and shape disciplines. That's all I was going to say.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I think what is already emerging from this conversation is that we are, as it were, shaping the identity of shape, of us belonging here, but also thinking about our relationship with STEM. And in many ways, we need to be more interdisciplinary within shape, as well as crossing over to STEM subjects for more consciously, deliberately, and optimistically than perhaps we had before, because there must have been a bit of a sense of a chip on the shoulder. They have STEM and we have nothing, whereas we are partners now. I was wondering if, and this actually neatly brings us to the question of value, of how you measure the value of the different disciplines, different areas, how we evaluate the worth of research. Is there a feasible scorecard? And if so, what might that involve? And I was wondering if I could ask Julia perhaps to comment on this topic.
Yes, no, very happy to. And I think just amazing, so many comments actually I could just pick up from what's just been said across the panel as well. But it's just fantastic to be having this conversation actually, and to be using shape to enable it. So I think one of the comments was made, I think by Katherine, that if we want to measure ourselves on the same basis as STEM and compete on the same terms, then in a way we probably may fail in that sense. So to go to Gemma's point, we're not, but actually even then I contest that, because you could say, well, for STEM, they can produce a cure for cancer. To which I would say, yes, that's right, but it's actually shape subjects that enable that actually cure to actually get to those people who need it, either through design and financing of a healthcare management system, and or through the understanding of appropriate different cultural norms, so that those people will actually recognize that as a cure, as a curative medicine, and not something as alien to their culture, which means that they will reject it. So actually, STEM on their own will not provide a cure for cancer. They'll provide a potential for cancer to be cured, but it is shaped subjects that will enable that to be deployed and to actually reach those people who will need it. But to come back then to the scorecard. So I've thought a lot about the scorecard, and you know, in a way, the REF forces to do that, doesn't it? By, you know, on the impact and measuring impact and what's the impact, and economics often, you know, is going to often dominates, doesn't it? So it's how many jobs, what's the salary, what's the GDP contribution, etc., etc. And actually, even if we narrow it, even if we keep it on the economic scorecard, I actually think shaped subjects do actually very well on all those different metrics. And we have the data on that from different from different sources, whether it's on longitudinal employment data, whether it's on contribution to GDP. We are primarily a service-based economy. Shaped subjects fuel our financial services, our legal services, our creative arts industries, our cultural heritage, etc., etc. But I think we miss a lot, actually, if we just focus on the economic. And this isn't a new point, but if we're building back better, I really think we have to change the scorecard. And here I've been inspired by work they've been doing in New Zealand. I think we probably all just want to move to New Zealand, actually. But within New Zealand, they've got something called the Living Standards Framework, which they're starting to use as a government to assess their performance and drive towards what I would call a kind of new prosperity scorecard. And that takes into account social science research, which focuses on the need for different capitals, as it were, in social science terms, or economic terms in particular, to be realised in order to have in my terms, a full and prosperous life. So that's economic, produce capital, yes, for sure, but also human capital, which is about individuals, about their skills, it's about their education, it's about their health, it's about their well-being. It's also about social capital. And this has come out really strongly in the discussions around COVID. I mean, even to have Andy Haldane, who's chief economist at the Bank of England, calling social capital as counter-cyclical capital. So in other words, that's the stuff that kicks in when everything else is going down the drain in economics terms, which you've seen, which is social cohesion. But also it's about cultural strength of our cultural identity, our cultural institutions. And I would extend that to our governance institutions as well, the health of our democracy, our legal systems, etc. So social capital is absolutely intrinsic and often something which has often been taken for granted, and our contribution towards enhancing social capital hasn't necessarily always been recognised. And then finally is our natural capital, which is the environment, which is climate change, biodiversity, and the strength and health of that natural capital. And of course, these things are interdependent. So I think so 2 points then really. One, once you broaden the scorecard, then you've got a much richer agenda for building that better. And secondly, you immediately see the place of shaped subjects in contributing to every single area, as it were, of that new kind of scorecard, or that new bringing those metrics into play. Because health and well-being fundamentally interacting with STEM in human health and well-being. In our social capital, dominating, I would argue, is the dominant force, is the dominant need for shaped subjects, because that is their milieu, that's where we live in the human and the social capital. But as geographers have been demonstrating to us for more than decades, the huge nexus of work in our natural capital, but also taking from shaped subjects, not just, as it were, the economics in terms of how you design carbon taxes and trading schemes, etc., but going all the way through to humanities, literature, arts, in terms of how we interpret our natural environment and how we actually construct our natural environment, and how we label it and how we value it. So I think if we broaden that scorecard, the role for shaped disciplines becomes incontrovertible, in my view.
Thank you, Julia. If I could ask the panelists to share their thoughts, and if you just raise your hand, I will see who wants to speak now. Dermot.
Yeah, I think we need to think about what distinguishes human beings. And I think there are two characteristics which are relevant to shape. And one is our wish to play. We are a playful species. And another one is our intense random curiosity. And both these characteristics are hugely aided by shape subjects, because random curiosity is what has propelled this very young species very quickly to a dominant position on our planet. And its randomness is a way of exploring the unexpected. Events, dear boy, events, as Macmillan famously said, change the agenda by themselves. I think back to my Cambridge years in the 1970s, where in the mid-1970s, the University of Cambridge abolished its lectureship in Persian studies. 1977, it found the Iranian Revolution came along, and it had no one to do any teaching about it. And it abolished it because it didn't seem to be any particular use, and it was just a matter of idle curiosity. So we need to champion these characteristics of human beings. We don't need to champion them, they're there. But we need to say that these are the characteristics which particularly characterize the shape subjects.
Thank you. Joanna?
Yeah, I think we all know the value, but I think we need to shout louder, and I think we need to get our message across actually and be more assertive. And I just wondered, I was thinking about this before this started, about, this is a moment perhaps to do this. And there's kind of two things that my children and myself, I feel, have been quite exposed to on the media recently. One has been the government briefings, where they have a scientist, or they have two scientists, and it's all about the science. When sort of social science gets mentioned, it's in relation to behavioural science, and it all gets kind of twisted and devalued and all the rest of it. But the other very, very important kind of global event in that sense has been the Black Lives Matter movement. And as I've been trying to explain to my children, we can't understand that through science. We need, history, and we need decolonial perspectives, and we need geography, and we need critical thinking. And I just feel, I wonder, because there is a momentum there, and people are, for obvious reasons, very interested in this. And there may be a moment for us to shout louder about, if you want to understand, why this movement is so historic but so present. Shape will give you that understanding in a way that STEM subjects, clearly won't. So that's what I wanted to say in relation to that. I just feel that there's a kind of moment maybe to shout about this.
Thank you. Would any other panelist want to come in on this? If no, why don't we tackle the penultimate question, which deals specifically with education and society. So how can shape transform education and society in Britain? I mean, we've already touched on some of these themes, but Dane? You're muted.
Muted, sorry, that's my error. There's been a lot of discussion around sort of competition of sort of marking out the territory of shape subjects. And the example was that maybe a scientific subject could create a vaccine or a cure for cancer, but the mechanism of integrating those technologies into a society is very much a shape kind of endeavour. I think what we sometimes kind of suffer from is the I don't know, I suppose academic ghettoization of subjects, especially kind of in the kind of the school curriculum. And people seem to think of, oh, this is my science lesson, this is my history lesson, this is my English lesson, this is my technology lesson. But actually more and more the most interesting kind of research and innovations across kind of the economies are much more kind of multidisciplinary and diverse in their kind of way that they function. They're messy. There's no clear answer of how this is all going to work. And so specifically young people oftentimes think that science is understood. You know, you think of a maths equation and you've just got to solve it to get the right answer. And some people are drawn to that kind of certainty. Other kind of aspects of kind of the school education system kind of are much more open-ended and sort of deliberative and discursive. And it turns out that like a lot of scientific and kind of STEM research is exactly like that. It's unclear what the solution is. You look at the kind of, you know, the vaccine developments that are going on at the moment, it's not clear if any of them are going to work. There's lots of vaccines in development, and that's a really nice example of where even sort of STEM subjects are quite fluid actually in how they're kind of approaching things. And, you know, shape subjects are naturally quite, I don't want to use the word messy, but they're just complicated, complex, and necessarily not necessarily defined as a kind of, you know, final kind of answer to these kind of problems. And so I think kind of finding ways to get people to think about you know, complex issues in a way that brings in shape and also STEM subjects in a more kind of agile way, I think is a much more useful way of describing how academic endeavour, industrial innovation, and just kind of enjoyment and creativity of kind of human existence is possibly a more useful way of describing what these subjects might be. So I think it is really useful to kind of use, you know, something like shape as a counterpoint to the STEM. But I think if we start kind of going in that sort of tit for tat, or where is shape, where is STEM, where is shape, oh, hang on, get off my patch, you've just stolen geography from me, you know, like we're all sort of in it together, if you like, you know. So if we can kind of embrace these subjects in a way that are kind of multifaceted, multidisciplinary, and get young people and the gatekeepers that kind of help advise those young people on the subjects that they might want to choose, that's possibly a way that is more useful to all of the subjects that we're kind of talking about today and the global economy.
Thank you. Of course, this raises the question of how we segregate subjects at every point in our education system. We had a meeting this morning about decolonizing the syllabus in English, and what began emerging is that we have to be a lot more interdisciplinary and transhistorical in how we teach English, for instance, so that we're not just doing the drama of the 1580s, but we're thinking more broadly how the epic relates to hip hop, for instance. Would anyone else from the panel want to come in on this?
Yeah, quick point. Let's be brutally honest about this. Part of the initiative of SHAPE is to persuade government to give more equal resources to the SHAPE subject alongside STEM. And this is a really important job to do. And the British Academy is really caught up and seized by this. We talk to government, we talk to civil servants. This is not an academic debate in any sense. It's about DOSH. And it's really important that enough resources are given to SHAPE subjects. And let us not lose sight of that. And that's the reason why we need to present the hard facts about SHAPE careers are really profitable careers in every sense, both financial and moral, for self delight and awareness. That SHAPE subjects, as Julia said, are the subjects which actually underpin our economy. We don't make widgets anymore in this country, and we probably never will again. But we do other things which give this economy a particular shape in a more broad sense. So let's be hard-headed about this alongside all the sensible things we also need to say about human curiosity, being boundless, etc.
Thank you. Joanna?
Yeah, I just wanted, I just became aware via Twitter actually of the DFE's report that was published, I'm not sure, in July at some point, about it's basically a kind of restructuring package for failing universities or universities that desperately need an injection of cash. And one of the recommendations was to orient themselves towards STEM courses. That's coming from the government. So I think I don't know enough about it to comment any further, just to say that when I read that, I just thought, well, yeah, there is a kind of financial imperative as well to these, to these discussions.
Katherine?
Yes, I mean, I think all the way along from funding of schools to universities to research grants, I think it is really very much about hard cash, and I think our government is very strongly committed to strengthening STEM subjects, and there is some commitment to strengthening, for example, creative industries and so on, but within very narrow frameworks often, and the categories that are then required and within which one must make the case are often extremely narrow. So I think this initiative is extremely important, and promoting it to government, to promoting it in the education system is enormously important. And I think the interdisciplinary aspect, I think, is also important, because in the sciences, my impression is that there is in fact also considerable appreciation of the value of communication skills, of the various interdisciplinary potentials, but there can be battles when it comes to cash, where those kind of interests are then put aside for, as it were, fighting for one's own patch and so on. So I think making the case to government, making the case in every public forum is enormously important. And I think defining the types of capital that we're dealing with is one way to go. It's not the only way. It's certainly a very important one. And I think in schools, it's going to be terribly important in the time ahead to ensure that that there is an understanding of careers not all being in the sciences, not all the good sort of lucrative careers are in the sciences, and even if those are perhaps sometimes the lucrative careers, that doesn't really help somebody who's not interested in pursuing sciences, but actually where their talents lie elsewhere, and where they may have equally fulfilling careers that are also in salary terms effective and rewarding and so on. So I think we need to be very careful not to allow debates like that to all get pushed in one direction. I think that the label STEM has been very effective in promoting the sciences over the last 10-15 years. I mean, it's not so long ago that, for instance, chemistry was a subject that was under threat, in a sense. There were a few children who were choosing the subject. That has been turned around, and I think the concept of STEM did a great deal to achieve that. So I think pushing this this alternative sort of name brand is a very important way to go, and I think the British Academy and partners have done us a great service in bringing that to fruition.
Thank you. Patricia, did you want to comment?
Yes, I wondered whether Joanna could tell us what she was going to say about gender, because obviously, even with regards to STEM, there's an attempt to appeal to women and young girls more, and certainly there's a dearth of women in science, and all sorts of projects have been on the way to encourage greater participation. But there's also the issue about about the value of these subjects and how they're treated, because if they're dominated by women. So perhaps Joanna just said she had something she wanted to bring in on that, and I wondered whether we could hear her.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I was kind of reflecting on, and this is just informally through I'm the secretary of the Gender and Feminist Geography Research Group, and we're thinking a lot about mentoring, post-COVID mentoring initiatives. And one of the things we've been discussing is the kinds of research that have been hit by COVID. So, and what our sense is that, you know, the kind of qualitative research, that's field work that involves kind of, you know, going into communities and kind of developing relationships and so on and so on. It would seem to be, and this is very kind of anecdotal, that women or kind of female researchers are struggling more with the kind of restrictions, and will find that the kind of impact on potentially on their academic careers kind of post-COVID, the impact might be more severe. And that's aside from all the kind of newspaper articles and various reports that are coming out suggesting, you know, that women scientists, never mind kind of social scientists and humanities, are, you know, as a consequence of COVID, are picking up more of the childcare, are just struggling more with kind of homeschooling than their kind of male counterparts. And the other thing I was thinking really was about the split. I had to look at some HESA data between the split between undergraduates in non-science and science disciplines. And even though absolutely there's been this huge push towards attracting or attempting to attract women into sort of STEM subjects, there is still this really big imbalance. And I think according to the data, I'm not sure how reliable that is, but there was around 800,000 people within non-science compared to 500,000 within science disciplines, which again made me think about, you know, value and kind of what we're valuing as a society, and why we do tend generally to kind of value disciplines and subjects that are more male dominated than others. But I'm sure there are lots of other, I don't know if anybody else on the panel has thought about the kind of gender aspects, but there are probably many more that I've not thought about.
Thanks very much, Joanna. We have left one of the questions unanswered directly, which is, what are the wider global implications of shape? And I wonder if anyone would want to comment briefly on this. At that point, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. And if you could, or comments from the audience. So if you could raise your hand in the chat function if you would like to speak. But Joanna, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, just very briefly. So one of the things I work on is international student mobility. And I was thinking about the fact that, you know, international students do tend to be oriented towards choosing STEM subjects. And I don't have an answer. I just think it would be quite an uphill battle to get international students, for example, to opt, you know, I guess to rebalance it, you know, towards shape disciplines. There was a comment, I think, Paulina, you made at the start as well about immigrant families, again, kind of valuing more STEM subjects. And I think that's certainly the case, the work I've done around sort of immigration and education. And again, you know, I don't have an answer, but I think that's something worth bearing in mind, that certain, you know, families, certain communities put more value on STEM subjects. And I think a lot of it is related, some of it is related to a sense of status and cultural capital. And I think a lot of it is related to a sense of employability. And this idea that if you do shape subjects, you're not employable, which is clearly not the case. But I think, again, that goes back to messaging and us needing to get this kind of really important message across, that our graduates are as employable, if not more employable.
I wonder if I could do something slightly unorthodox. I see that our Access Fellow from Jesus, Dr. Matthew Williams, who specializes in politics, is here. And Matt is involved extensively in organizing summer schools and Opportunity Oxford. And I just wonder if Matt could perhaps say a few words about how the young people that we are trying to lure to come to Oxford and study subjects across the board, not just STEM, how they are reacting to our attempts.
Hi, thank you for including me. Yes, so I've found it very difficult when selling highly competitive universities in the most disadvantaged parts of the country to convince students who are typically the first generation in their family to commit to subjects that they have never studied, maybe never even heard of, and they don't easily perceive the career trajectory that emanates from them. And so the way we've tried to get around this is to design programs that are explicitly interdisciplinary, and then point out in a quite sort of clunky instrumental fashion that you've just been doing some modern languages. Can't you see the skills you're developing there? You've just done some historiography. Can't you see what wonderful ideas that's helped you develop? And then explain to them the suite of things that are on offer, because it's patently clear that in the better heeled portions of our society, there's a much greater awareness of the value added of all sorts of degrees across the spectrum. And it's part of the explanation as to why universities like Oxford are consistently overrepresenting privately educated students, because they will apply for archaeology and anthropology, and they will apply for Persian and Arabic, fantastic degrees that if I'm going to, Port Albert, I just receive typically blank faces from the first time I might mention such things. But after a while, it does become quite clear that these are viable options, and certainly utilizing our fellows and alumni makes a huge difference. So I've been really interested in what's been said, but I particularly agree with the idea of being interdisciplinary, trying not to be competitive with each other, but trying to sort of say how we're all trying to cope with the complexities of the universe and the feebleness of our own brains in tackling that complexity, and we all have something to bring to that. Thank you so much, Matthew.
I've noticed that people are beginning to ask questions on chat, and there are a couple of short questions from Kathy Schrank from Sheffield. So Kathy, if you could unmute yourself and pose your questions, and then if members of the panel would just say who wants to tackle the questions.
Hi, thanks for this. It's been a really fascinating discussion so far. I've got two questions that I think relate. First of all is how we overcome the cynicism / suspicion of SHAPE researchers about acronyms like SHAPE, where they like the initiative but they're suspicious of the packaging. And the other one is the way in which lots of my admin roles here have often involved fostering interdisciplinary research, and so often SHAPE researchers get used to provide the vehicle for STEM research. So again, it's about packaging. So we provide the pretty packaging for ideas coming from science rather than, sort of the ideas themselves. It's how we get STEM researchers to take our ideas and research seriously, and not just our ability to communicate. So two slightly different things about communicating ideas and SHAPE.
Thank you. Katherine and Julia.
It seems to me that the key argument for why SHAPE is a good idea is that it gives shape to something which otherwise is simply that which STEM isn't. I think that we have been suffering in the humanities and social sciences from the disparateness of the subjects, and the fact that STEM subjects have managed to forge something coherent out of diversity, which has had a real impact. So government policy, documentation and so on speaks of STEM, which 10, 15 years ago wasn't the case. And that is those subjects are getting the funding, and that has become something in the public consciousness, whereas humanities and social sciences subjects is simply a long series of different disciplines which are not perceived as having equivalent value. So I think it is to do with how we shape concepts, and that can have a lot of power, and including financial power and including policy power.
Thank you, Julia.
I completely agree, and that is the idea behind creating the term SHAPE. And as I say, we didn't start off to do this, but this seemed ultimately to have the most potential for communicating both what our disciplines are, and the value that they have and the value that they bring. Dave made a comment right early on, which was about identification and how people will identify with shape or will or won't identify with it. And so it was some trepidation, to be honest, that we kind of launch out into, you know, basically half of the academic disciplines and say, hey, why don't you call yourselves this? But it is there as an option. I mean, it is there as an option, which I hope will obviously have global domination, but it does depend on people, you know, seeing themselves as part of a group of subjects and disciplines which have sufficient focus in common that they can see themselves as being part of that group, even if they're, you know, as I say, the economist doing a deep regression analysis is in a way miles away from, you know, is miles away from the performance arts, but both are concerned, as Em said before, with people and with societies, and that's fundamentally what brings us together. And I think by having therefore that just common term, then hopefully it will just give more power and more voice to these subjects, which are, I mean, one doesn't want to come in saying, you know, help, because I want to come in saying we're of equal value and come in strong, and say actually we really do matter. We're not victims here, we matter. And we matter in ways that you're using, but you don't realise. I think Matthew's point about, well, you don't realise the skills that you're using when you're using shape skills because they haven't been labelled as such, is actually a really interesting one. So that's what we hope in relation to, you know, to be able to achieve by just putting shape out into the community, and hopefully people then will use it themselves, both within the community and others, to actually create that wider recognition, which then ultimately will flow through, hopefully, to policy decision making.
Thank you, Julia. It was very interesting this morning when I was surfing the web to see how much shape presence there was. And Edinburgh seems to have taken the idea and run with it. There is a College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences details clearly what they are doing. And Dermot and I were talking before the formal discussion started about the fact that we still haven't heard anything formal from Oxford, but I think in all our departments and in all the institutions and also members of the audience, if we could talk to the powers that be and actually encourage them to use shape within our institutional structures, that would certainly be a step in the right direction. I noticed there was a question from Neil Boyce. I
yes,
hope
hello.
I haven't, or Niall, sorry.
Niall, yeah.
Sorry.
Right, thanks. Well, thank you very much, Paulina, and thanks to the whole panel for a really fascinating discussion. I think my note of caution is that it doesn't do to overemphasize or overestimate the robustness of STEM. So from my experience, my day job is in publishing in mental health sciences, and I'm also a part-time research student at Birkbeck in Renaissance culture. And so what that means practically is that I spend half of my time being told that there's a crisis in the mental health sciences, and the other half being told that there's a crisis in the arts and humanities. And I've begun to wonder recently if these might be two sides of the same crisis, which in terms of mental health sciences manifests as a perceived disengagement with culture, and in the arts and humanities manifests as a perceived disengagement with value. So taking on board, in particular, Dane and Dermot's comments, I wonder if complementarity with STEM subjects should maybe be prioritized as a message for the SHAPE project.
Thank you. Would colleagues want to respond? Dane?
I totally agree. And you know, part of the kind of messaging is it has to be differentiated. Obviously, you know, different segments of society, whether it's government policy makers and funders, publics, cultural actors, they might want to have a very simple kind of message framework. And then we mentioned the kind of the crisis in chemistry recruitment a few years ago, and there was a comment about how that was kind of turned around. It wasn't really the STEM community that supported that. It was the Royal Society of Chemistry, obviously, that spearheaded the recruitment into chemistry. And what they did was that they provided granular examples of what chemists did. So they had this really effective campaign called Not All Chemists Wear White Coats. And it had a really kind of lovely kind of photographic kind of asset base of people kind of snorkeling in the ocean, kind of doing kind of, you know, oceanographic kind of chemistry. They had people, you know, women in kind of hard hats kind of on kind of chemical engineering sites. And they really kind of unpicked what it is to be a chemist. And it allowed people and students, and particularly their parents, and again, it comes back to the kind of note that Matthew was pointing out, is that people just don't necessarily understand what they don't know yet. You know, so help people kind of find a way to build their identity towards a subject. You know, and the nice thing about shape subjects, in contrast with STEM subjects, is that there's a huge amount of public opinion towards them already. You know, so there's some, you know, polling data that is saying that only sort of half of, you know, a third of the population has some kind of, you know, natural affiliation or kind of enthusiasm towards kind of STEM stuff, whereas easily a half of the population wants to kind of have a go and sort of be involved with shape subjects. So there's already a huge amount of groundswell in this space, but as soon as you get away from the kind of GCSE and A-level subjects, people don't necessarily know what these new kind of unfathomable subjects might be like. And whereas the kind of easy thing with the science kind of business or the STEM kind of business is that there might be a complicated machine that kind of you need to have to be able to do science experiments. So you might have, I don't know, a synchrotron or a laser or something, I don't know. Whereas with shape subjects, you don't necessarily have to have that infrastructure. So in some ways, it's easier, I think, to be stumbling around the complex language of what shape subjects are. So if people wanted to kind of defend their patch, sometimes it's easier to present a barrier to protect your space and sort of demarcate your kind of academic area by going, this is the kind of construct you have to understand before you're allowed in. Whereas with science, they kind of understand that it's usually an equipment or another sort of technological barrier. So I think just recognizing individual kind of ghettoization of subjects and just finding ways to kind of allow people to kind of move much more freely across those subjects, and including across the shape and STEM kind of, you know, made up divide. We don't need to go back into CP, Snow and FR Leavis, do we? You know, kind of these made up divides that we're kind of creating. I think complementarity is the key, but absolutely when you're kind of arguing for kind of budget, you might be wanting to kind of make sure that, you know, you're not just kind of losing ground to the STEM, which appears to be economically valuable, whereas, you know, we know that the creative industries are massively productive in terms of economies.
Thanks very much, Dane. It seems to me that we have different target audiences. There's the government, there's the wider society, and there are also colleagues who might feel beleaguered or a bit disaffected by the perceived lower status of our disciplines. So there are great opportunities here, and the fact that lockdown enforces us to stay at home also means that our digital presence, you know, shape goes digital. It offers opportunities for us to reach audiences that otherwise might be less easy to reach, precisely because people spend more time online, and because not just this one discussion, but our web presence, more conversations, and the way we present access in terms of talking to people. That goes back to the question of careers, and not all chemists wear white coats. Well, not all people who study English literature become English teachers. One of my former students was on the COVID front line because she trained as a medic. Another is an opera singer, another works in a bank. And I think we need to communicate this more widely. There's a question on chat from Renee Adams. Renee, would you like to pose it yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for this panel, a really important subject. So my question is really simple, and it's related to what Paulina just said. So what practical steps, do you have any ideas for what can we practically do to advance, you know, shape? Like talking to, you know, Paulina, you mentioned before we should talk to the people in power, but how does one engage in these conversations? How does one say the ref isn't everything? Do we join forces? I'd be interested in any thoughts you have on what we can do.
Quick word.
Donald?
I say the British Academy are already doing it, and we are not doing it in competition with the Royal Society. These are two organisations working very closely together to talk directly, face-to-face, socially distanced, of course, with civil servants and politicians, as politicians find time from Brexit and COVID to say anything at all. But the other very important audience is that of the BBC and the media. And that's something we're also tackling because shape subjects are natural fodder for Radio 4. The Radio 4 audience, I mean, with the wonderful example of Melvyn Bragg over the years, to think that what is basically an undergraduate seminar can command an audience of 4 million is absolutely marvelous and gratifying. In other words, there are open doors which we can just push at. Journalists and media, that's hugely important. And if we stress the fun of what shape subjects can do, the satisfaction of having curiosity answered, those are the sorts of lines to plug.
Donna?
Yeah, I was reflecting on children's TV actually. I think going into schools is really important. But I was also thinking about how STEM subjects are actually represented at very lower levels. So on CBBS, for example, or CBBC, and there's quite a few sciencey type, well, women in white lab coats type programs that demonstrate how things work, you know, from a sort of scientific perspective. And then you've got horrible histories, which my daughter really likes, which is fantastic, representing the kind of shape subject. So I think the media obviously clearly has this huge role to play, and just getting children at a younger age thinking about other possibilities. You don't have to, you know, wear a white lab coat and go into science. And the other thing I just wanted to say very briefly, going back to Matthew's point when he mentioned Port Talbot, I'm from quite near, well, I'm from Swansea, which is not too far from Port Talbot. You know, there's a class issue because of course working class kids are risk averse, or their families are risk averse, and they do tend, you know, there's a lot of academic literature on this, they tend to pick subjects that they see as less risky. So a clearer route into an employment, you know, sorry, not unemployment, employment, to a career. So I just think, again, we have to be a little bit more vocal about the fact that you are very employable, I think, coming out of doing a sort of choosing shape disciplines at university. So I think those are the 2 points I wanted to make, really.
There was a comment on chat from Sanj Gupta, a former student who read history and English at Jesus before moving to LSE for her master's. Sanj, did you want to say publicly what you've written?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to say thank you, first of all, because I am an international student. I have been for the last 4 years. I'm also from an immigrant family and have been a SHAPE graduate for all of these 4 years as well. So this really hits at the very personal experiences that I've had at home, in educational spaces, and in the workplace as well. And so I've been thinking a lot about how to persuade more students from minority backgrounds and from backgrounds such as mine, that SHAPE isn't such a terrifying opportunity, or isn't such a leap into the dark as I have found. And I think one of the reasons I found for this resistance was the fact that visas and immigration permissions have historically favored people with STEM backgrounds. Even the points-based immigration system that was launched in the UK recently gives extra points to those who are wishing to pursue a research career in STEM. And so I wonder whether that's potentially a factor, especially in the dimension of international students who also count as racial minorities, perhaps, in elevating the prestige of STEM over other subjects, and whether there are ways to address that, or what other things account for this prestige gap.
Thank you, Sanj. I mean, actually, Brexit also will have really unfortunate implications, because of course the government has just said that foreign students from the EU and Switzerland will have to pay full fees, and there will not be the loan facility for them. But of course, we are thinking also about the wider world. Since we only have 5 minutes left, I was wondering if I could ask Julia to share her reflections on the conversation and perhaps avenues for the future, what else we can do. And it seems to me that this is a conversation that very much has to be continued.
Absolutely, and I'll try and pick up some of the comments in the chat as I go down. So I found this a really encouraging conversation, actually. Completely agree on everything that's been said, particularly in relation to interdisciplinarity and stressing complementarity. You know, just by using the word shape, we're not going to solve the challenges of interdisciplinarity. We know what those are, but I think it just really emphasizes that in terms of, you know, what we tell ourselves and how we tell stories to others, if we bring all of our areas of knowledge to bear on really critical issues which are of relevance to people today, that they can see their place within them, as it were. So whether it's on, you know, the history of vaccines, you know, whether we go back from the pandemic, we go back from, you know, so we look at the economic restructuring that followed the pandemics in the 1600s through to the Spanish flu, through to today. You know, if we do an arc of history, then you can see how different areas of knowledge have come to bear in resolving or addressing those issues. So I think that's the first point, which is that we need the stories that we need to tell, as it were, so that people can find their place within shape subjects and within STEM, have to really bring that whole cornucopia, as it were, of disciplines to bear and illustrate that. So that would be the first. I think in relation to perceptions, and when we're getting down to politicians' perceptions, or certainly students' perceptions, then notwithstanding my plea for the bigger scorecard, as it were, we also have to understand what motivates people. And that understandable drive for security and drive for, you know, am I going to get a job out of, you know, archaeology or history? Or to be honest, am I going to get a job out of chemistry? And none of them, unless you're in a vocational subject, so I'm in law, for example. So the number of students I've had in the first year who say, well, I don't want to do law, but my parents want me to do it, from all sorts of different backgrounds and from around the world. You know, and you do law if you're not good enough to do medicine, basically, in those areas, is to actually just, again, give that data. There's a data issue here, which is, yes, you can have the salaries, you can have the careers, but also to show the people, you know, who does these subjects, how do they do them, and what do they produce as results? And I think we just need to get much better at saying those stories in a really loud and confident way. And so hopefully that will pick up on the student points which are in there. And then lobbying for better criteria. And this is I recognise this is an intra-university, you know, question rather than a wider societal question. You know, we will continue to have the debates on the definition of impact in the ref. We will continue to have those. There is room within the definitions. We just, you know, what then comes down to is actually the behaviours. You know, ref selects the structures, and then it's behaviours which are exhibited within those structures. So I think for that, it's for me, it's going back to that scorecard, actually, which is, yes, it's about jobs, but actually it's also about social cohesion. It's also about the strength of our democratic institutions. It's also about the strength of our intercultural understandings. It's also about the quality of our environments and our health and our skills. And so that we can start to change the narrative in that way. But just fantastic panel. Thank you so much for inviting us along. And I really do hope that people take shape it, use it, mobilize it. And we have digital assets that you can use as well. So just let me know and we can send you a partner's pack.
Thank you very much, Julia. And thank you very much to our panelists for really instructive, illuminating, challenging comments, to the audience for participation. This panel will be recorded and available online, and please share it with everyone. And I look forward to discussing SHAPE with you in the future. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.